If kindness still exists, why is everyone pretending not to see? The question lingered in the air just as a silver necklace slipped from an elderly woman's trembling hands and landed softly on the polished marble floor of Brookstone Galleria outside Charlotte, North Carolina. The tiny pendant spun once beneath the bright ceiling lights before coming to rest beside expensive leather shoes that simply stepped around it as though neither it nor its owner deserved a second glance. The woman, dressed in a faded gray coat despite the mild 68-degree afternoon, bent carefully to retrieve it, but before her fingers reached the chain, a young white sales associate folded his arms and spoke loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "Ma'am, if you're not buying anything, you're blocking the entrance." A few people slowed their pace. Some exchanged awkward glances. Others looked away, unwilling to become involved. The old woman quietly nodded, clutching the strap of her worn handbag as if apologizing simply for existing. She never argued. She never raised her voice. She only whispered, "I'm waiting for my son." The employee gave a skeptical smile. "Of course you are." A soft ripple of laughter drifted through the crowd. At that exact moment, Marcus Brooks pushed open the revolving glass door with one hand while the other held the tiny fingers of his 8-year-old daughter, Ava. He had just finished another maintenance shift repairing heating systems across 3 apartment complexes on the edge of the city. His work boots carried traces of dust. His navy work shirt still bore the stitched company logo over the pocket. A lunch cooler hung from one shoulder, nearly empty except for a bottle of water and a folded napkin. His paycheck would not arrive until Friday, and after rent, groceries, and Ava's school supplies, there would be little left. Still, when Ava spotted the necklace on the floor, she tugged gently on her father's hand. "Daddy," she whispered, pointing toward the sparkling chain. Marcus followed her eyes. He saw the frightened woman. He saw the employee's impatient expression. He saw dozens of strangers pretending the moment belonged to someone else. Without hesitation, Marcus released Ava's hand, stepped forward, and crouched onto one knee. He carefully lifted the necklace before another passing shoe could push it farther away. Holding it with both hands, he offered it back to the woman with the same quiet respect he would have shown his own mother. "I believe this belongs to you, ma'am." Her eyes glistened with surprise. "Thank you," she said so softly it almost disappeared beneath the hum of conversations and the distant melody of the mall piano. Marcus smiled warmly. "Would you like to sit with us for a minute? You shouldn't have to stand here alone." Around them, the whispers grew louder, but Marcus never noticed. Ava simply smiled at the woman as though inviting her into their little world was the most natural thing anyone could do. Marcus guided Eleanor toward a quiet seating area beside the food court, where afternoon sunlight poured through the towering glass skylights, casting warm reflections across the polished floor. The noise of clattering trays, cheerful conversations, and children laughing blended into a distant hum, creating a strange contrast to the silence surrounding their small table. Eleanor lowered herself into the chair with visible relief, carefully smoothing the sleeves of her worn gray coat before looking at Marcus with grateful eyes. "You did not have to do this," she said softly. Marcus offered a gentle smile as he removed his faded work cap. "My father used to tell me that people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you gave them." Ava climbed into the chair beside the elderly woman without the slightest hesitation. She reached into her small backpack and carefully pulled out a homemade oatmeal cookie wrapped inside a napkin. "Daddy says sharing makes food taste better," she said, sliding it across the table. Eleanor looked at the little girl for several seconds before accepting the cookie with trembling hands. "Thank you, sweetheart." Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had not heard simple kindness in a very long time. Marcus walked to a nearby cafe, opened his wallet, and quietly counted the bills inside. $22 and some loose change. That was everything he had until payday. He glanced at the menu board, calculated the total in his head, then ordered 1 bowl of chicken soup, 1 cup of hot tea, and 2 small grilled cheese sandwiches for himself and Ava. The cashier smiled politely while handing him the receipt, unaware that those few dollars represented nearly every cent Marcus had available for the next 2 days. He carried the tray back carefully, setting the steaming bowl in front of Eleanor first. "Please," he said. "It is fresh." She stared at the soup as thin wisps of steam rose gently into the air. "I cannot remember the last time someone bought me lunch." Marcus shrugged lightly. Everybody deserves a warm meal. Eleanor lowered her eyes, hiding emotions she could not quite put into words. As they ate together, Ava filled the quiet with innocent conversation about her spelling test, her favorite library books, and the birdhouse she wanted to build for a school project. Eleanor listened closely, smiling more with every sentence. Watching the little girl laugh reminded her of memories she had not revisited in years. Memories of a young boy who once held her hand exactly the same way Ava now held Marcus's whenever she spoke. For a brief moment, the years seemed to disappear. The loneliness that had followed Eleanor throughout the day began to loosen its grip. But not everyone inside the mall welcomed the peaceful scene. From across the food court, the same sales associate pointed toward their table while speaking with a sharply dressed operations manager wearing a polished name badge. Both looked directly at Marcus, then at Eleanor, before exchanging quiet words. The manager's expression hardened. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and began walking steadily toward their table while several nearby employees quietly stepped aside, sensing that the calm afternoon was about to change in a way none of them expected. The operations manager stopped beside their table with the practiced smile of someone who had spent years hiding authority behind polished manners. His name tag read Richard Collins, and although his voice remained calm, every nearby employee instantly recognized the tone. "Good afternoon," he said, folding his hands in front of him. "I have received several complaints from customers who feel uncomfortable." Marcus slowly looked up from his sandwich. "We are only having lunch." Richard glanced briefly at Eleanor before returning his attention to Marcus. "This seating area is intended for paying guests who are actively using the dining facilities." Marcus quietly slid the receipt across the table. "Everything here was purchased 10 minutes ago." Richard barely looked at it. "That is not the issue." Eleanor lowered her eyes, immediately understanding that she was the real subject of the conversation. She began gathering her handbag. "It is all right," she whispered. "I can leave." Before she could stand, Ava gently reached over and rested her small hand on Eleanor's arm. "Please stay. You have not finished your soup yet." The simple sentence seemed to echo much louder than the crowded food court around them. Several shoppers slowed as they passed. Some pretended to check their phones while quietly watching. Richard maintained his professional smile, but it had become noticeably thinner. "Sir," he continued, addressing Marcus again, "we are simply trying to maintain a pleasant environment for everyone." Marcus remained remarkably composed. Years of fixing broken furnaces in freezing apartment buildings had taught him patience. Years of raising Ava alone had taught him something even greater. "A pleasant environment begins with treating people like human beings," he answered quietly. Richard inhaled slowly, clearly surprised that Marcus had not become defensive. "Nobody is questioning that, Mr. Brooks." "Mr. Brooks." Richard nodded. "However, this woman has been approached several times today because employees believed she might need assistance leaving the property." Eleanor finally looked up. "I told them I was waiting for my son." Richard offered a polite but doubtful expression. "Yes, ma'am. We heard that." Marcus noticed the subtle emphasis on the final sentence. It was not what Richard said. It was how he said it, as though waiting for her son sounded impossible. Ava frowned with innocent confusion. Why does nobody believe her? The question settled over the table like unexpected silence. Richard hesitated for the first time. Around them, conversation softened. Even the sounds of dishes and cash registers seemed farther away. Marcus gently squeezed Ava's shoulder. "Sometimes people decide what is true before they know the whole story." Eleanor blinked several times, holding back emotions she had hidden behind quiet dignity all afternoon. She had lived long enough to recognize kindness when she saw it, and long enough to recognize prejudice disguised as policy. Richard straightened his jacket once more. "I am going to ask all three of you to come with me so we can resolve this privately." Marcus looked through the towering glass entrance where gray clouds had gathered above the parking lot. The first drops of rain tapped softly against the windows. He turned back toward Richard with calm eyes that never carried anger, only quiet conviction. "We are not causing trouble," Marcus said. "We are simply refusing to leave someone behind." Richard held Marcus's gaze for several long seconds as the rain outside intensified, streaking silver lines across the towering glass walls of the mall. The warm afternoon light slowly faded behind thick clouds, leaving the food court wrapped in a softer, quieter glow. Around them, conversations resumed in hushed voices, yet curious eyes continued drifting toward the unusual group. Marcus remained standing beside Eleanor, one hand resting gently on the back of her chair, while Ava leaned against his side, her small fingers wrapped around his calloused hand. Richard finally spoke again, choosing every word carefully. "Mr. Brooks, this is not personal. We simply have procedures." Marcus nodded respectfully. "I understand procedures. I work maintenance. Every building has rules. But good rules are meant to protect people, not embarrass them." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor slowly lifted her head. "Young man," she said quietly, looking toward Marcus instead of the manager, "you have already done more than enough for me today." Marcus smiled gently. "My mother used to say that people only become strangers after we decide to. Stop caring." Eleanor lowered her eyes again, visibly moved. She had spent nearly an hour watching hundreds of people pass by without stopping. Expensive watches, tailored suits, polished shoes, shopping bags from luxury stores. So many faces, so many opportunities for kindness. Yet it had been a tired father carrying a nearly empty wallet who had chosen to see her. Ava suddenly looked toward Eleanor with innocent curiosity. "Does your son know you are waiting here?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "He knows. He called this morning and asked me to meet him here after one of his meetings." Ava tilted her head. "Then why has he not come yet?" Eleanor glanced toward the large entrance where rain now covered the glass like flowing crystal. "Sometimes important people become busy." Marcus quietly answered before Eleanor could continue. "The people who love us are still human. They can be late." Eleanor looked at him with surprise, almost as though he had read the thoughts she had been carrying all afternoon. Richard checked the time on his watch and discreetly spoke into the small radio clipped beneath his jacket. A security officer appeared several yards away, but remained where he was after noticing Marcus's calm demeanor. There was no argument, no raised voices, only an uncomfortable situation growing more complicated by the minute. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the food court as another cafe employee wiped nearby tables while pretending not to listen. Marcus noticed Eleanor shiver slightly as a cool draft slipped through the automatic entrance doors each time shoppers hurried inside to escape the storm. Without saying a word, he removed his light work jacket and carefully draped it across Eleanor's shoulders. She immediately shook her head. "No, dear. You will be cold." Marcus smiled. "I have spent enough winters fixing rooftop heating units. I will be all right." Ava giggled softly. "Daddy is always warm." For the first time all afternoon, Eleanor laughed. It was quiet, gentle, and genuine. Even Richard seemed momentarily caught off guard by the sound. Before anyone could speak again, every phone in the immediate area vibrated almost simultaneously. Employees looked down at their screens. Richard's expression changed first. He stared at the notification, then instinctively looked toward the mall entrance, just as several black sport utility vehicles slowly rolled beneath the covered driveway outside, their headlights cutting through the falling rain. The black sport utility vehicles came to a smooth stop beneath the covered entrance, their glossy surfaces reflecting the gray afternoon sky as uniformed drivers stepped out and opened the rear doors with practiced precision. A quiet wave of curiosity swept across the food court. Employees straightened their uniforms. Store managers instinctively adjusted their jackets. Richard Collins looked down at his phone once more before slipping it into his pocket, his confident posture suddenly replaced by visible uncertainty. "The chief executive officer has arrived," one employee whispered. Another immediately began clearing the walkway leading toward the entrance. Marcus noticed the sudden change but paid little attention. His concern remained with Eleanor, whose fingers tightened gently around the warm teacup he had bought only minutes earlier. She stared toward the entrance, her eyes softening with an emotion that Marcus could not yet understand. "Looks like your son picked a busy day to visit," Marcus said with an easy smile. Eleanor nodded quietly, but before she could answer, Richard stepped closer once again. His voice had become noticeably less forceful. "Mr. Brooks, perhaps it would be better if you and your daughter waited somewhere else for a few minutes." Marcus looked at him calmly. "Why?" Richard hesitated. "There is an executive event beginning shortly." Marcus glanced around the nearly empty dining area. "We are not in anyone's way." Richard forced a polite smile that failed to hide the tension gathering across his face. "Please understand, Important guests are arriving. Ava looked from Richard to her father with innocent confusion. Daddy, are important people different from everybody else? Marcus knelt beside her chair, so their eyes met at the same level. No, sweetheart. They just have bigger jobs. They still deserve kindness, and so does everyone else. Eleanor quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though those simple words had reached somewhere deep inside her heart. Outside, another black vehicle arrived behind the first. Umbrellas opened. Security personnel spoke softly into radios. The entire entrance seemed to move with careful coordination. Then the revolving doors slowly turned. A tall man in a tailored navy suit entered the mall with measured confidence. His silver tie caught the light beneath the chandeliers as several executives hurried to greet him. Every employee standing nearby immediately offered respectful smiles. Richard instinctively took one step backward, smoothing his tie before walking toward the approaching group. Halfway there, he stopped. The executive had not slowed to acknowledge anyone welcoming him. Instead, his eyes searched the crowded food court with growing urgency. His expression carried none of the confidence expected from one of the state's most successful business leaders. It carried concern, real concern. He scanned every table until his gaze suddenly froze. Across the room, Eleanor slowly stood from her chair, still wearing Marcus's worn work jacket across her shoulders. For one long heartbeat, neither of them moved. The executive's face softened completely. He abandoned the welcoming committee, ignored every extended hand, and walked quickly across the polished floor toward the elderly woman. Conversations faded into silence. Even the music drifting through the speakers seemed to disappear beneath the sound of approaching footsteps. Marcus instinctively stepped aside, believing a family reunion was about to unfold, never realizing that everyone in the mall was about to discover exactly who Eleanor truly was. Daniel Whitmore stopped only inches from Eleanor, and for a brief moment the entire food court seemed to forget how to breathe. The successful executive who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without showing emotion now looked like nothing more than a worried son. His eyes immediately settled on the oversized work jacket resting across his mother's shoulders before lifting to her tired face. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice carrying far more relief than authority. "I have been calling you for almost an hour." Eleanor reached up and gently touched his cheek with the tenderness only a mother could offer. "My phone battery died," she answered with a small smile. "And then I found some very kind people." Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders at last. He carefully embraced her, not caring that dozens of employees and shoppers stood watching in complete silence. Around them, executives who had hurried to greet their chief executive officer now remained frozen several feet away, unsure whether to interrupt such a deeply personal moment. Richard Collins felt the color drain from his face as realization settled in. The elderly woman he had repeatedly questioned was not a confused shopper. She was Eleanor Whitmore, the mother of the man who owned the entire shopping complex. Richard instinctively looked toward the young sales associate whose confident expression had completely disappeared. Neither man spoke. Neither seemed capable of finding the right words. Daniel stepped back just enough to study his mother more carefully. His eyes noticed the half-finished bowl of soup, the steaming cup of tea, and the simple oatmeal cookie resting beside the empty napkin. Then he noticed Marcus standing quietly a few feet away with Ava holding his hand. Marcus had already begun collecting the empty trays, assuming the family deserved privacy. He never stepped forward. He never tried to introduce himself. He simply smiled at Eleanor as though his only concern was seeing her reunited with someone who loved her. Daniel followed his mother's gaze. "Who are they?" he asked softly. Eleanor's eyes brightened with unmistakable gratitude. "The reason I was never alone today." She slowly removed Marcus's jacket from her shoulders, folded it carefully with both hands, and walked toward him. "Young man," she said gently, offering the jacket back. "You gave warmth to someone everyone else had forgotten." Marcus accepted the jacket with an embarrassed smile. Anyone would have done the same. Eleanor shook her head almost immediately. No, they did not. The quiet truth settled over the room more heavily than any accusation ever could. Ava looked up at Daniel with innocent curiosity. "Are you her son?" Daniel smiled warmly for the first time since arriving. "Yes, I am." Ava nodded as though everything suddenly made perfect sense. "She talked about you while we ate lunch." She said important people can still be late because they are human. Daniel glanced at his mother, visibly humbled. Outside, the rain began to soften, and pale afternoon sunlight slowly pushed through the retreating clouds, filling the glass atrium with warm golden light. Yet inside the mall, another kind of storm had only begun. Daniel quietly turned his head toward Richard Collins, whose uneasy expression revealed that he already understood exactly what question was coming next. Daniel's eyes never left Richard Collins. The silence stretching across the food court felt heavier than any speech he could have delivered. Shoppers stood motionless beside storefronts. Employees lowered their heads. Even the security officers who had quietly gathered near the entrance seemed reluctant to move. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm enough to command the entire room without rising above a conversation. "Richard, I want to understand exactly what happened before I arrived." Richard swallowed hard. "Sir, I believed your mother." His words faded before he could finish. Eleanor gently interrupted him. "You believed I did not belong here." There was no anger in her voice, only quiet honesty. Richard lowered his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Daniel looked toward the young sales associate standing several feet away. The employee's shoulders had lost every trace of confidence. "And you?" Daniel asked. The young man took a slow breath. "I assumed she was waiting here without permission. I did not ask enough questions." Daniel nodded once. "No, you did not." His attention shifted toward Marcus. "Mr. Brooks, would you tell me what you saw?" Marcus looked almost uncomfortable being placed at the center of everyone's attention. He glanced briefly at Eleanor before answering. "Your mother was standing alone. People spoke to her without kindness. My daughter noticed her necklace on the floor. We simply stopped to help." Daniel listened, carefully without interrupting. "Did anyone threaten you?" Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. They only wanted us to leave. And yet you stayed." Marcus smiled faintly. Leaving her alone did not feel right. Daniel stood quietly for several moments, studying the man in front of him. His worn work boots still carried dust from a long day's labor. His shirt showed signs of honest work. His wallet, resting beside the lunch tray, was thin enough to tell its own story. Yet this man had spent nearly everything he had to buy lunch for a complete stranger. Daniel slowly turned toward the executives who had followed him inside. "Do all of you see what I see?" None of them answered. They did not need to. Daniel continued. "This gentleman never knew who my mother was. He expected nothing in return. He did not help because she had influence. He helped because she needed someone." His words echoed through the food court with remarkable clarity. Eleanor stepped beside Marcus and gently placed one hand on Ava's shoulder. "Your father has raised an extraordinary young lady." Ava looked up at Marcus and smiled. "Daddy always says the easiest way to make the world better is to help the person standing closest to you." Eleanor's eyes shimmered again. Daniel looked toward his mother before speaking one final time. "That may be the most valuable lesson anyone has taught inside this building." Richard slowly removed the identification badge clipped to his jacket and held it in both hands. "Sir, I accept full responsibility." Daniel did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked around the luxurious shopping center with new eyes, as though seeing the building for the first time. Marble floors, crystal lighting, designer storefronts, and polished glass suddenly seemed far less impressive than one tired father who had quietly chosen compassion when everyone else had chosen convenience. At that moment, Daniel understood that the greatest failure inside his company had nothing to do with business. It had everything to do with the people who had forgotten how to see another human being. Daniel slowly walked toward Richard and accepted the identification badge without saying a word. He looked at it for only a moment before placing it into his jacket pocket. "This badge represents responsibility," he said quietly. "It is never meant to become permission to decide who deserves dignity." Richard lowered his head. "You are right, sir. I failed today." Daniel nodded. "Human beings make mistakes. What defines us is whether we learn from them." He turned toward the small group of employees who had gathered nearby, including the young sales associate whose eyes remained fixed on the floor. "Every one of you works inside buildings that my family invested in. But none of these buildings matter if people leave feeling smaller than when they arrived." The words settled over the room with remarkable stillness. No one defended themselves. No one searched for excuses. Eleanor stepped forward and gently touched Daniel's arm. "Son," she said softly, "anger teaches very little." Daniel looked into his mother's eyes, and the tension in his face gradually faded. Then what should I do? Eleanor smiled with the quiet wisdom earned through a lifetime of experience. Teach them what kindness looks like. Daniel remained silent for several seconds before turning back toward Richard. Beginning tomorrow, every manager in every Whitmore property will complete customer care and dignity training. Not because of what happened to my mother, but because this could have happened to anyone. Richard looked genuinely surprised. You are giving me another chance. Daniel answered honestly. I am giving you the opportunity to become the leader you believed you already were. Tears gathered in Richard's eyes as he nodded slowly. I will not waste it. The young sales associate stepped forward next, visibly nervous. He looked directly at Eleanor. Ma'am, I judged you before I ever spoke to you. I am deeply sorry. Eleanor offered him the same gentle smile she had given Marcus only an hour earlier. Then begin tomorrow by asking someone their story before deciding who they are. The young man quietly nodded. Marcus watched the exchange without expecting recognition. He reached for the empty tray, preparing to throw away the dishes before taking Ava home. It had been a long day, and tomorrow morning another maintenance schedule awaited him before sunrise. Daniel noticed Marcus gathering the trays himself and immediately stepped forward. Please allow one of our employees to take care of that. Marcus smiled politely. Old habits are difficult to break. Daniel chuckled softly. Some habits should never disappear. Ava slipped her hand into her father's again, looking proudly up at him. Eleanor bent down slightly, so she could speak at the little girl's eye level. Your father has given you something more valuable than money. Ava tilted her head. What is that? Eleanor gently squeezed her small hand. He has shown you that character is measured by how you treat people who cannot give you anything in return. Ava smiled, not fully understanding the depth of those words, yet somehow knowing they were important. Outside, the storm had completely passed. Warm afternoon sunlight poured through the towering glass windows once again, filling the food court with golden reflections that danced across the marble floor. It felt as though the entire building had quietly exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Marcus picked up his worn lunch cooler and slipped his work jacket over one shoulder, while Ava happily held his hand, believing the afternoon had finally come to an ordinary ending. He nodded politely toward Daniel and Eleanor. We should get going. Thank you for sharing lunch with us. Daniel stepped forward before Marcus could turn away. Mr. Brooks, may I ask you one more question? Marcus stopped. Of course. Daniel looked directly into his eyes. Why did you help my mother when everyone else walked past? Marcus thought for only a second before answering. Because one day I hope someone will do the same for my daughter if I am not there. The words settled over the room with remarkable quiet. No executive could improve them. No prepared speech could equal their honesty. Eleanor smiled through grateful eyes. That is exactly how strong families are built. Daniel slowly reached into his jacket and removed a simple white business card. There was no dramatic gesture, only sincere respect. I know you did not help expecting anything in return, and I will always honor that. But if you ever decide you want a different future for yourself or for Ava, call me personally. I believe our company needs people who understand character more than people who only understand business. Marcus accepted the card, but looked at it only briefly before placing it carefully inside his wallet beside a faded photograph of Ava. I appreciate that, sir. Daniel smiled. No, I appreciate you. Ava looked up with bright eyes. Daddy fixes broken things. Daniel glanced toward Eleanor before quietly replying. He fixed something much bigger today. Eleanor gently embraced Ava one last time. Never stop listening to your father. Ava nodded with complete confidence. I will not. Marcus and Ava began walking toward the main entrance as golden sunlight poured through the towering glass walls, replacing every trace of the afternoon storm. Their reflections stretched across the polished marble floor with each quiet step. No photographers followed them. No applause filled the building. They left exactly the way they had arrived, carrying no trophies and asking for no recognition. Behind them, Daniel remained standing beside his mother, watching the father and daughter disappear beyond the revolving doors. After a long silence, Eleanor spoke softly. You spend every day searching for exceptional employees. Daniel kept his eyes on the parking lot where Marcus's aging pickup truck slowly pulled away beneath a bright Carolina sky. Today, he answered, I found an exceptional man. Eleanor slipped her arm through her son's. Do not forget what he taught this building. Daniel smiled thoughtfully. I will not, and neither will anyone who works here. Outside, Marcus started the truck, and Ava rested her head against the window, watching the shopping center fade into the distance. Daddy? She asked quietly. Yes, sweetheart. She smiled. Grandma was right. Marcus glanced at her with gentle curiosity. About what? Ava looked back at the sunlight dancing across the windshield. Kind people never really leave. They stay inside other people's hearts. Marcus smiled without another word as the truck disappeared down the tree-lined road, leaving behind a building that looked exactly the same on the outside, but inside had become a place where one ordinary act of kindness quietly changed every life it touched.